More than 100 years have passed since Friedrich Nietzsche declared that God is dead, or God is taught in German, thereby providing headaches for all philosophy students that continue to this day. This phrase has become Nietzsche's most famous statement. Even those who are not familiar with his book, The Gay Science, where it is contained, know it. But how well do we understand the meaning of these words? Or more importantly, what do they mean to us? Nietzsche was an atheist all his adult life, and therefore the literal meaning of the phrase is excluded, and it rather refers to the idea of God. After the Age of Enlightenment, the idea that our universe was governed by the laws of physics rather than by divine providence became a reality. Philosophy has shown that the legitimacy of power is justified not by divine anointing, but by the consent of citizens. All moral theories could now exist also without reference to a creator. It was a significant event. Europe no longer needed God as the source of morality, human values, or the laws of the universe. Philosophy and science took its place. The massive secularization of Western thought helped Nietzsche realize that God not only died, but that it was people who killed him with their scientific revolution, their desire to understand the world. However, the death of God was not perceived by Nietzsche as an unambiguously positive phenomenon. Without God, the core belief system of Western Europe was in danger, as the philosopher wrote in Twilight of the Idols. By renouncing the Christian faith, you are pulling the right to Christian morality from under your feet. The latter is by no means understandable in itself. Christianity is a system, a coherent and integral view of things. If you break out of it the main concept, faith in God, then you also destroy the whole. However, for some people, according to Nietzsche, this turn of events will be a good sign. Having heard the news that the old God is dead, we philosophers and free souls are greeting a new dawn. A bright future was already visible ahead. When the old system of meanings became obsolete, the opportunity arose to create a new one. However, Nietzsche believed that the removal of this system would cause despair and hopelessness in many people. After all, the question arises, what is the meaning of life if there is no God? Even if there was a God, the entire Western world now knew that he did not place us at the center of the universe. The real world opened up before us. The universe was not created solely for human existence. Nietzsche feared that such an understanding of the world would lead to mass pessimism, the will to nothing, which was contrary to the life-affirming philosophy that he promoted. Nietzsche described his fear of nihilism and humanity's reaction to it in his book, The Will to Power. What I am telling you is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is approaching, which now can no longer come in any other form, the emergence of nihilism. Our entire European culture has been moving for a long time in some kind of torture of tension, growing from century to century, and seems to be heading towards catastrophe. Nietzsche would not have been surprised by the events that took place in Europe after his death. Communism, Nazism, nationalism, and other ideologies that spread after World War I sought to provide man with meaning and values as a worker, an Aryan, or some other endeavor, just as Christianity gave meaning to God's children in the form of life on earth. While Nietzsche might have rejected all of these ideologies, he would certainly have recognized humanity's need for the meaning they provided. Nietzsche's phrase, God is dead, can be interpreted in 3 ways. Cultural interpretation. The polysemy of Nietzschean images is a generally recognized fact. The death of God is no exception. There is a whole cartload of possibilities for interpreting this metaphor. The most common is the cultural interpretation, according to which God means traditional European values, and the death of God, accordingly, means their devaluation. Purely historically, this was due to the development of positivism, the strengthening of the role of natural sciences, which supplanted theology, Darwin's theory that came into fashion, all kinds of revolutionary sentiments and movements. All this contributed to the decline of Europe. However, for Nietzsche, something else was much more important. He believed that the prevailing Apollonian tendency in the history of European culture, based on illusory transcendental values, had weakened people so much that when this tendency began to weaken, Europeans immediately fell into a nihilistic mentality. Religious interpretation. Religion, according to Nietzsche, turned people into slaves. A slave is one who cannot find the foundation of his life in himself. As soon as scientific discoveries shook the authority of religion, the slavish nature of Europeans was immediately revealed. If there is no God, then everything is permitted. A slave is not capable of self-restraint. The madness that arose during that period and then covered the whole of Europe is proof that Nietzsche was right regarding his contemptuous assessments of his contemporaries. If we turn to the religious interpretation of the death of God metaphor, an interesting interpretation can be found in Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He believed that this was a completely positive concept, meaning the moral maturity of the subject, depriving the Christian of the opportunity to justify his ignorance by reference to a higher authority. From the moment the death of God is fixed as a certain historical and religious fact, every believer is obliged to take moral responsibility personally. Bonhoeffer, who became a victim of the Nazi regime, radically revised the traditional positions of religion in society and proposed a model of Christianity without God, in which all moral and ethical imperatives are preserved, but their basis is transferred from God to the individual. Philosophical interpretation. Within the framework of the philosophical reading of Nietzsche's metaphor, the death of God is understood as a rejection of determinism and logocentrism. The concept of God expresses the idea of the presence of a final and exhaustive external determinant, and the metaphor of the death of God, accordingly, discredits the idea of external causation. The death of God, in this case, turns out to be not only a statement of some kind of destruction, but also an affirmation of a field of new possibilities for understanding reality. For example, the self-disclosure of an object in the formation of plurality, its autonomous creative potential. If earlier an object was regarded exclusively as dependent, heteronymous, subject to centralized commands of the system, then in the new indeterministic version, the object is placed in an anti-cybernetic context, rhizome in Deleuze, transgression in Foucault. The death of God in the philosophy of postmodernism means the liberation of an object from external coercive authorities. In literature, the text is liberated from the author. In politics, the citizen is liberated from the state. In art, the artist is liberated from traditions. In philosophy, the thinker is liberated from the hegemony of logocentrism, etc. If God meant transcendence, then his death means the foregrounding of immanence. Immanence means the plural self-movement of meaning, multiplicity of equivalent interpretations, freedom of constitution, and reading of the semantic field. As Foucault notes, the death of God liberates existence from the existence that limits it. Since the cultural paradigm, based on the statement of the death of God denies regularity and necessity. Probability and chance become its main parameters. To paraphrase Einstein, we can say that the death of God only means that God plays dice. Having foreseen the possible outcome of events, the philosopher offered us a way out, the creation of our own individual values, creating meaning in life by those who live this life. The archetype of the individual capable of this is the overman, Übermensch. However, Nietzsche presented it as an incomprehensible ideal that most could not achieve. The superhuman, who, as it seemed to him, should already exist on earth, would create the meaning of life based on his will, and would realize that ultimately people themselves are responsible for their choices. In the book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the philosopher writes, "The game of creation requires, my brothers, a sacred yes to life. The spirit now wants its own will. The courageous superhuman will not rely on dogma or public opinion regarding his own values." Anticipating the difficulty of creating a superman, Nietzsche proposed an alternative answer to nihilism, one that people would likely choose the last man, the most despicable thing that lives a quiet life without thinking about its individuality or personal growth. We have discovered happiness, the last people say, and blink. To the disappointment of Zarathustra, Nietzsche's mouthpiece, the people he preaches to, are interested in the latter man's lifestyle. Nietzsche considered it the most likely solution to our ability to cope with the death of God. However, here we can ask the question, if we know that God died so long ago, then why didn't we all become atheists? Nietzsche says, God is dead, but such is the nature of people that for thousands of years there may still exist caves in which his shadow is shown. Perhaps we are only now seeing the manifestation of the philosopher's statement. Atheism is becoming increasingly popular in almost every European country, and its newfound growth in the United States signals a new cultural shift. But unlike the time when atheism was enforced by communist groups, there is no longer a need for a worldview that supports the absence of God. It simply doesn't exist. And indeed, the British philosopher Bertrand Russell viewed Bolshevism practically as a religion. It gave meaning and dictated values to people. But this source of meaning ceased to exist without faith. As many atheists know, the absence of God without an additional philosophical structure to provide meaning can cause an existential crisis. Are we at risk of becoming a society struggling with our own meaninglessness? Are we on the verge of nihilism? Are we now more vulnerable to ideologists and con men who promise to do what God did for us and for society? While Americans are increasingly pessimistic about the future, fewer are atheists than religious people. In the long run, Nietzsche seems to have been mistaken about our ability to cope with the idea that God is dead. We may have coped better with the death of God than Nietzsche thought. We are not all the last people, and humanity has not found itself in a situation where all morality is considered relative and meaningless. We seem to have succeeded in creating a world in which people's need for God is reduced, without the consequences of collective despair or chaos. Do we, as independent people, strive to create our own values? Do we create the meaning of life ourselves, without the help of God, dogma, or public choice? Perhaps some of us do, and if we understand the meaning of Nietzsche's phrase, God is dead, we are more likely to create ourselves. Despair over his death can give way to new meaning in our lives. As Jean-Paul Sartre said, life begins on the other side of despair.